Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Kingwill, and on behalf of Miles Hutchison, Sian Bajwa, and the YIPA Victoria Committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the opening session of week 4 of the 2020 YIPA Masterclass series. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all of the lands we're meeting on today, wherever that may be, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So thank you so much for joining us this morning. Whether it's your first masterclass event today or you've been to other sessions, we're super grateful that you've made the time to attend this morning. I've been looking forward to this session for a few weeks now, and it's awesome to see so many people online who have joined us today. For those who don't know, IPAA or IPA stands for the Institute of Public Administration Australia. The IPA Victorian branch is a member-driven organisation which connects, empowers and celebrates Victoria's public purpose sector. Young professionals are a key part of the sector, and the young IPA or YIPA community is an important part of this. You can be part of the YIPA community through our IPAA Victoria membership. Visit the IPA Victoria website and in particular the Get Involved page for more information on membership and YIPA. You can also join us on LinkedIn for resources related to this event and other ongoing professional development opportunities. Events such as this would not be possible without the support of our partners. To our major partner, the Victorian Public Sector Commission, new Commissioner Adam Fennessy, PSM, and former Acting Commissioner Julia Griffith and the team, thank you for your support. The work you do across the sector for young professionals is greatly appreciated. To our supporting partners, the Victorian Managed Insurance Authority, thank you to Andrew Davies and his team for their support of young professionals across the sector. And at Deloitte, Ellen Derrick, Deloitte's National Public Sector and Public Policy Lead, along with Ian Trevora, Deloitte's Victorian Public Sector Lead, and all the team, thank you for supporting the Masterclass series and for providing content for many of the sessions across the month. Thanks to all of our partners. So the YIPA Masterclass series focuses on change. The first 3 weeks have discussed reflecting on change by learning from the past, anticipating change by understanding change drivers, and responding to change to get the best outcomes. The fourth and final week, of which this keynote kicks off, will focus on affecting change in your work. Has there ever been a more uncertain time facing the public purpose sector? In a new COVID-19 world, forces of change are imminent and unavoidable. How executives manage and lead change and innovation will be paramount for the public purpose sector to thrive and continue to serve its purpose. We're so lucky today to have a wonderful facilitator and 3 exceptional panelists to discuss this very issue and their experience driving change and innovation. Jennifer Walcott will facilitate today's conversation. Jennifer has a track record of developing, negotiating and driving innovative strategy, including regulatory reform and corporate strategy. Jennifer has also been an IPA Victoria board member since 2016. That's before I hand over to Jennifer to introduce our panelists and kick off proceedings. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. To do that, we have the Q&A box in the toolbar. You can ask questions at any time by typing them in. You can also see other people's questions and vote them by giving them a thumbs up. That way, the most popular questions will rise to the top. And remember that you can send your questions in at any time during the discussion. I will also note that this session is being recorded. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the 4th week of our Marathon YIPA Masterclass series. I've really enjoyed dipping in and out of the series, and I look forward to this week. So on behalf of myself, and can also say on behalf of my panelists, I also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the many different lands that we're on. And I noticed that from the comments and people, it's wonderful to see people knowing the traditional owners of the country that they're joining us from. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And pay my respects, all of our respects, to their elders past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations people who are joining us today. Special shout out to you. Look, I've got to say, I think it's like, you know, for anyone who knows me out there, they know I'm a bit of a pessimist probably. So it's wonderful to be forced to facilitate a session where I think we're going to focus on optimism and opportunity. And this week is going to be a focus and a theme. But before we do that, I do want to acknowledge that we are smack bang in the middle of a global pandemic, and we are still in the middle of that, Victoria. It's wonderful to see some encouraging signs from all the community's efforts for the lockdown we've had in Victoria. but it's been a really tough time. And I would like to acknowledge people have lost family and friends and loved ones. People are sick. People have lost jobs. It's I would like to acknowledge the pain and the hurt out there. So in no time in talking about the optimism and opportunity do we diminish that or fail to recognize that. But it is an incredible time, and in times there are opportunities. I'm sure, like me, when you've been on the web or potentially reading or whatever, you've been hearing about things like Shakespeare wrote so many plays and his opportunity. Why haven't you written a major world thing? But also that pandemics and those kinds of diseases all through human history have shaped our social, our economic, and artistic institutions. The Enlightenment followed, the Italian Renaissance after the Black Plague, and the Enlightenment, and helped hasten on the Industrial Revolution. So there is a lot of reflection on the past and thoughts about, well, what does this mean for us where we are right now? And I shared in the chat box my favorite bit of pandemic reading if you're interested in that kind of historical perspective. But let's bring us back to today. Let's bring us back to some of our experiences now. And I've just got this wonderfully diverse panel to help us kick off and reflect and think about that. And rather than me introducing them all, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. As Will said, for me, I'm a career Victorian public servant from over 30 years. And I suppose in terms of talking to some of the younger and upcoming people, one things I would say is I really enjoyed in my career is I've got to work in central agencies like Sam, one of our panelists is today, the very center of our state government. I've got to work in big government departments. I've been working in statutory authorities. I've worked on major inquiries. At the moment, I'm looking at a career as a non-executive director, as Sue's a non-executive director at this point in her career as well. And, it's just been a great variety of roles from policy to service delivery. It's been a fascinating and interesting career. And one small personal thing about me, I'm a nature nerd. So I'm one of those tragics that's basically surviving the lockdown by doing my backyard birding list. And noticing all the beautiful wattles that are out in bloom now. I'm going to ask each of my panelists to do a little mini introduction of themselves. And I'm also going to ask them to reflect on one personal experience that they have had this year in 2020 with the challenges, first our unprecedented bushfires and then the pandemic unfolding, which made them really realize that they were living through or they were in a really, really different time and we're going to have to work in a really different kind of way. I'm going to start with you, Sue. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Sue Rankin. I currently operate my own executive mentoring and coaching business, together with holding a number of directorships of companies in the health, the biotech, insurance, and the property space. I was a CEO for almost 30 years, so I draw on that experience in my business and for my non-executive director roles. I love helping people grow, and I'm really proud that last count was about over 20 people who were once working for me and now CEOs in their own right. So that makes me feel really good. Away from work, I love spending time with my large family. We've got 7 kids and awaiting the birth of our 14th grandchild. So life's pretty busy for us. I love entertaining and I love sport. I'm a tragic Cats supporter in the AFL and the Rebels in the rugby union. And I also follow the netball. So that's a little bit about me. Do you want me to go on about the time?
Now, I want you to give me one example.
Okay, I think it was before the pandemic hit, and it was the devastation of the bushfires, and there were some really innovative things coming up on social media. And there were 2: one, buy from the bush, and support the bushfire businesses. So I went a bit crazy on online shopping and supporting all these businesses out in rural Australia. And it made me realize then that we have, over the past, I think we've become so global, we've forgotten about the talent and the expertise and the innovation right at our front door or our back door. And it's made me very aware of being Australian and supporting Australian businesses.
Cool. Sarah, over to you. Introduce yourself. Give us an example of where you realized the world had changed.
Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Goss. I'm Head of Innovation at Ericsson, part of the executive leadership team. My responsibility is for company-wide strategy execution and our overall innovation agenda. Separately, I also chair Ericsson's Diversity and Inclusion Council. And I guess my dual roles I see go very much hand in hand, because diversity and inclusion are really the bedrock of creativity and innovation. A bit about me, I mean, I work full time now, but when I took my current role on the exec team in mid-2016, I was working 3 days a week. Before that, I was in a job share, which is a working arrangement where 2 part-time employees share the 1 full-time role. And whilst I was working part-time for about 8 years, I was also founding director of a health tech startup in the aged care space called UMPS, where I still remain a shareholder. And I guess outside of my work at Ericsson, it's been really interesting to see the journey of that particular startup supporting older Australians who are some of the most vulnerable in our community at this time. So for me, I feel very lucky in my career, because I get to be active at the intersections of the things I'm passionate about, which is diversity and inclusion, innovation, leadership, and also the future of work. And all of these areas, I suppose, are really feeling the impact of disruption quite acutely at this time, especially due to COVID. I guess the moment that stands out for me is when both my partner and I were working full-time from home, and then we quickly had to also take on homeschooling our 2 young children. So we live in a very small inner city terrace house, and we share one, I'm going to call it our open plan co-working space, which is sort of our living area. And it was a period of a lot of adjustment when we first moved to that arrangement. My kids are 10 and 8. So they're still relatively young, but they're old enough that they're going to remember this time in their childhood when they were in ISO. And for me, that's quite grounding in terms of just the way I approach navigating this unusual time. And, you know, my grade 2 son, he needs a lot of encouragement to stay on task. And in the beginning, I think a lot of frustrations were shown, and there were, you know, edges were frayed and whatever. But when my partner and I spoke to each other, we said, you know what, we're really role modeling how to manage change and disruption right now for the kids. And we need to be very mindful about that, and to remain, I think, patient and present, because we choose how we get to show up for them and how we want to be there for them at this time. So, you know, my oldest son is 10, and I think the other learning with homeschooling is he hasn't been overscheduled as far as his curriculum goes. So he's got plenty of, well, they both do have plenty of time for play and creativity and pursuing their individual interests, which I think is really, really important. So my eldest, who's in grade 5, ISO has seen him enroll in a paleontology course on Coursera with the University of Alberta, because he's fanatical about dinosaurs. He's attended also small group writing classes because one of the mums is an author, and then also science classes run by one of the dads. So yeah, I think the face of education is also going to be changing as a result of the learnings from COVID too.
What a great insight, and a role model for all of us there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Shakespeare. Sam.
Hi, thank you. My name's Sam Trobe. I work at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. My current role there is heading up what's called the Mission Facilitation Office, which is based in the Secretary's office. And so it's working with the Secretary to oversee and coordinate the what we call the mission architecture, which is how we've sort of aligned the VPS, the Victorian Public Service, to respond to COVID. And it's been in place now for about going on nearly 6 months, so 5 months. And it was a framework that was set up back at the very peak of, so ahead of the first peak, in a sense, the first wave, to line up the government to make sure our response was coordinated and as targeted basically as possible. Prior to that, most of my sort of working experience has been in the federal sort of level, and I actually a bit further back than that, I actually was, I worked for 2 finance ministers as a political staffer back during the GFC. So I worked for the finance minister, Penny Wong, and Lindsay Tanner. So that's 10 years ago nearly. So I sort of have been through in a sense, the last
You've got crisis
economic
forum.
disruption as well. Yeah. And it's weird because they're very different crises, but sorry, they're very similar but very different at the same time as well. And I think the key things that sort of really sort of showed the sort of extent of and the depth of what we're in was, I can still remember the first time we got the epidemiological modelling. This is ahead of the first wave, and you sort of, it looked like they'd made some mistakes in terms of the daily case numbers, death counts, those kind of things. It was really quite, like, they were going for shock and awe. They kind of achieved it. It was really significant, and it sort of gave us all, and that's sort of why this new structure kind of came about, was it sort of gave pause and came to the realization that actually just business as usual wasn't probably going to be sufficient for this, and that it genuinely needed probably a whole of government response to be able to plan for and coordinate the response. So I just we all thought they were mistakes. They weren't, and then it sort of has rolled on. And now, as we enter the second wave, it's sort of went to a deeper part of the crisis as well. Though hopefully, I think the daily case numbers this morning were 116. So hopefully, we're on the right side of this, and it's coming well. Similar to Sarah, I think one of the things, I've got not a newborn but a 1-year-old, and it's sort of been interesting. It had to have been sort of normal work at the moment. I wouldn't get to see him nearly as much during the day. And so actually being able to, when he does new things each day, I'm literally just in the next room when he's not in childcare. And so it's sort of, for me, it's actually been a really nice and really joyful part of the whole experience, is actually just seeing him most of the day. Has its downsides too, because he's, a 1-year-old. But it's been actually, and that's just been a really enjoyable thing. And I think it's sort of, and I'm sure this will be a case for a lot of people, where it's probably made people rethink what a working week should look like and how they want their working week to look in a normal environment. And I think most people would probably accept that means they're at home more than they probably were last year, which is, I think, a positive thing.
It's really interesting in the responses how people have immediately brought their personal, and we're all doing this, at some levels, your personal circumstances and changes. I live in a house with 2 teenagers, and I'm just not going to discuss that. It's just, anyways, because we've got to be optimistic, right? Anyways, and that thing that, you're inside the tent, Will. So, Sam, you had the shock of those stats and the epidemiology, but most of us now have caught up with you by, reading articles and trolling the internet and listening to endless epidemiologists and trying to understand what that means.
Everyone's an expert now.
Everyone's an expert. The poor epidemiologist. Okay, so I want to ask another question, which is that during my lifetime in particular, neoclassical economics, neoliberal theory, has been on the relentless rise, which means, a pretty relentless push for small government across Western kind of developed countries like Australia. Working government has not always been chic. People can still get a rise out of me with brown cardigan comments. But here we have instantly, with situation, with both the fires and then the pandemic, governments at all levels are front and center. Commonwealth, state, and local government, and the role of government is to the fore, and people can start to understand and think about the role of government, and are forced to, whether they like it or not, in a way that they haven't. But one thing that's also been really interesting is also watching, collaboration between sectors. So government working with private sector, working with NGOs, working with community in different ways. And given we have got a kind of reflection here on government, I'm wondering whether any one of you would like to comment on sort of what you've seen in terms of the role of government, and particularly also government working with other sectors and where collaboration has happened. So it's like, Sue, it's not a sector that I've worked in, but, with the health sector, where you've got things that the role of the Commonwealth, the role of the state, but also private and public parts of the health sector having to come together and work together in ways that are unprecedented. you got any observations on that?
I think one of the most important things that I've noticed during this pandemic, Jennifer, is the instigation in the early days of the National Council. And I think that was one of the cleverest things that occurred, because it just set the scene. We're working together. This is going to impact Australia, and we're going to work out together how we're going to deal with this. And I think, you know, the federal government allowed states to, you know, do certain things their own way, but really there was that common conversation and common goal. Well, certainly to the outsider, that's how it appeared. Okay, I think more recently there's been, you know, fractious environments occurring, especially in regard to aged care here in Victoria, and I think it's also within you know, the state now with our stage 4 lockdown. You know, there's a lot of daily meetings across a range of sectors within health. So from aged care to, you know, public health to acute health. And I think one thing that I would like to see occur even greater is the work that primary care can do. I think that in the community, the GPs in the community can certainly be involved much more in the health and contact tracing and support of COVID people in the community, but they seem to sort of been left out a bit. And I'm not going to get into why that's happened, but I think there's an opportunity there where primary care can be involved more. And the fact that the government really sort of sat down with the private hospital operators early and said, surgery's off, you know, we're going to really second your services to be there for the pandemic. And in the first wave, we know there wasn't the great demand on hospital usage, but it set the scene that it could be done. And now, of course, you are seeing the private operators being involved in caring for COVID positive people, especially from aged care, because aged care, we have to remember, they're aged care homes, they're not aged care hospitals. So the staff really aren't trained in many areas to provide the level of service that we require now. So there's been a massive rethink about what we need to do. I think it's a long way to go, and I think as people get more tired, and I mean, this is an extremely tiring stage we're going through. You know, you're on call 24/7. You're front on the line, you know, 24/7. Zoom is tiring. I don't care what anyone says. It's much more tiring than sitting in a room with a group of people. So I think that there is a potential coming up, if we're not careful, to see some rupturing in collaboration, and we really need to focus on the ability we have as a nation to pull together. I mean, I don't know whether anyone else noticed a few weeks ago, you know, there was sort of a few digs from other states about Victoria, and you know, and now, of course, when you get a couple of small clusters occurring outside the state, they're starting to realise, hey, it could be there, but for the grace of God go I, it could have been us. And I think they're seeing and pulling back and collaborating more. So I think that opportunity to work together is a really important one. And I really hope that post this pandemic, we don't forget this and we continue to work together for the betterment of the country.
Oh, that's wonderful, Sue. You know, a little bit of a thumbs up there for the Federation. And yeah, while cracks, you know, do show and things get politicized and over time, I think generally it has been working well. And one thing we also throw around terms like system or sector in various areas we work, but you know, you're just touching on describing a very complex health sector system and the players. Yeah, exactly. And but you know, from our reading, again, we get a little bit of a flavor. The other thing, the first thing you said was meeting. You know, how much you have to talk and meet, and then you also close with the exhaustion. And I think everybody, including new young professionals coming up, there's great lessons there for contributing, but also, you know, self-care and looking after each other during a long and sustained period. So Sam, you're right in the middle of the center of the government collaboration piece. What kind of really occurs to you there?
I agree with Sue. I suppose the National Cabinet's been fascinating to watch, because if anyone who's been involved in any level of government for the past however long, it's known that sort of COAG, you know, often went to lowest common denominator as an institution. So you know, the impetus of a crisis meant you could sort of push through like essentially, a couple of decades of legacy, legacy committees, frameworks, all those kind of things. And I think also fundamentally get the principals in the room. And in the room, I think what the biggest change is also in the room regularly. So there was a time when during the first wave, wave's not also a technical term, but during the first wave, there was, they were meeting sort of 2-3 times a week quite regularly. They're now meeting at least every fortnight or, so, give or take. And there's, I think, what you get from that is a level of familiarity amongst First Ministers, which possibly wasn't there, and a sort of really shared purpose. And that actually meant that you had really at the tops of all the governments an understanding of the problem and a willingness to basically get there with a solution, which has been really, really promising. I suppose, sort of to touch on Sue's point as well, the hope would be that level of collaboration continues past this. It's sort of, it's people come together in a crisis. You'd hope they can stay there for the recovery, because the recovery is definitely going to be longer and in some respects harder as the full economic impact of the crisis flows through over the next 6-12 months. It's going to be, it probably needs that level of collaboration as well. But I think also getting that level of collaboration at a state level, so across, there's a lot of collaboration at the moment. And this is in part of the structures we set up, was setting up, getting collaboration between departments to make sure that the approaches were as joined up across the state level as possible. But then also, how do you join up with other sectors to make sure, there are things that government can do well, there are things that government can't necessarily do well, and how do you leverage the NGO sector, private sector to really augment the response and to make sure it's joined up and getting the best people basically and the best brains around the problem. The other thing I think is interesting is with these kind of crises and the sort of the parallel to the collaboration piece is also the acceleration of what's going on. So if you look across, take telehealth as an example. Telehealth has been an idea for a long time that sort of day never came, and all of a sudden, by virtue of social distancing, we've now sort of done this quite fundamental shift into what should have been a service delivery model that was available for many years has now really come to the fore. And so I suppose these kind of crises also, you get collaboration, but also then you get acceleration of change, which is shows up a lot of opportunity. And you kind of can't wonder, if you step back, if you're sort of getting good collaboration and acceleration of reform, how do you try and create the environment for those things to happen in a not crisis setting? Like, these things happen around crises, but how do you actually, we accept outside crises that they don't happen, and how do you sort of try and create the environment for those types of reforms and those types of collaborative settings to occur, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, which would be is a task I think we'd all want to look towards as we come out the back end of the real crisis part of this into the recovery and reform part at the end.
And again, I think that's something, there's some great lessons there that, are society-wide, institutional, but there are also lessons we can individually take into our workplaces. And just jumping back to the National Cabinet, the fact that the individual relationships around the table, getting to know each other, spending that time together can make a difference. But talking about acceleration and health, segueing to you, Sarah, lots of discussion. We were already in an era of digital disruption, a huge era which you've been front and center and part of. And yeah, is there a real opportunity here in the acceleration space? What are you thinking in that space, experiencing?
Yeah, well, I'm an optimist, so let me declare that up front. But certainly I do think that is the case. I spoke earlier about the startup that I'm involved in. So perhaps to take an example that builds on what Sue and Sam have both spoken about, the aged care sector was one that was a bit of a laggard in terms of technology adoption, certainly in the provision of care and then the systems that work around it. AMPS provides a solution that supports older people to live safely and independently at home. So it uses smart home technology. And typically the purchase decision came from a loved one who was worried about an older parent or whatever, and their safety at home. But what we've seen as a shift during COVID is it's the older person themselves who feels vulnerable, is increasingly isolated, not able to see their carers who might visit them in their home or their loved ones as often. So they're making the choice. And it's a sense, it gives them peace of mind, it's empowering. And this is certainly, to Sam's point about the acceleration, this openness to technology from maybe people who were previously a little bit unsure has, the floodgates have really opened on that. And I think along with that, we're going to have to see policy and regulatory reform. But from a capabilities of the technology and meeting the needs of people where they're at, we're certainly seeing good signs of that now. I think the other thing, that's really stood out for me at this time is, the essential nature of connectivity. I work for Ericsson, we're in the telecommunications game, but all of us, as we've had to move to working and learning from home, have relied increasingly on our communications network. And we've all experienced frustrations perhaps when it's not been at the standard that we want, but that shift has happened. And you heard in my intro, I guess, my advocacy for flexible working. I have been giving presentations for many years where I've been saying flexible is the new black. But, whether we're talking job share, part-time, gig working, working from home, whatever it is, I never thought it would be in the lifespan of my career that we would see flexible working on any kind of scale, particularly in the corporate world. But, yet here we are. And many of us are working flexibly in terms of flexible start and finish times, or compressed hours, or in some sort of fashion like shift and night work it might be. I mean, these are all forms of flexible working. And the point is, it's working in a way that suits us and the other demands and priorities that we have. And the disruption of COVID, I believe, is going to force us to innovate around the whole way we think about engaging talent, engaging with colleagues, and also the physical design of our workplaces. They're not going to be, our workplaces that we eventually return to are not going to be the same workplaces that we left.
Education, I mean, you gave a great example too in your own house of, hopefully accelerating the thinking and the openness around different education models. And I certainly see that because I've got, even though I disparaged them before, of course I adore them, I've got both university students and high school students studying digitally. And it's interesting to watch them, like your children, be able to pursue personal interests in parallel with those, and sometimes riffing off each other. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
It's amazing. Sue or Sam, did you want to chime in on kind of thoughts and opportunities of leveraging the digital revolution with the opportunities with the current disruption?
Sure. I think there's huge opportunities. Before I do go into that though, and Sarah was talking about going back to workplaces and how different they're going to be. I mean, I think the whole concept of the square meter economy is something we need to focus on, because what was a commercial space pre-COVID is not going to work post-COVID because of the opportunity to have flexible workplace, but also of the physical distancing required going back into it. So there's going to be a massive shuffling around in commercial real estate going forward that I don't think we can even try and contemplate yet the impact of. But going back to the technology piece, I think the flexible workforce is a really important one. And I also, Sarah, have been pushing it for a long time. And I said, unless someone's customer facing, there is no need for them to be in an office 9 to 5, for example. So if they want to work flexibly, why can't they? So I've always pushed that argument. The one downside of all this, so with COVID, is the mental health issue that's really cropping up, and the social isolation, the team culture that's sort of falling down the crack a bit. The ability to have those corridor meetings and being innovative and planning, we are missing that. So there is a negative we need to be mindful of, but there's a huge upside in the technology opportunities to do flexible working. And for me, in my career at the moment, I haven't missed a beat. I mean, I Zoom with all my clients. So it's no different for them to catch up with them. And all my boards we're doing via Zoom or Teams or Citrix or whatever it is. And I find that, so for me, I love it because I'm not getting on aeroplanes every 5 seconds or driving to Geelong or driving into the city. I live in Mount Eliza. So for me, it's been wonderful. And if I do want to have social interactions, we have Zoom dinner parties and Zoom drinks and stuff. So we do catch up, but I do miss the family. I miss the kids and the grandkids terribly. But I think we need to be mindful of that mental health issue and the loss of opportunity if we do maintain pretty flexible working as well.
So hopefully we can retain some of the good and mitigate it with some actual face-to-face. I mean, Sam, is there something pulling you into a different realm about, you talked about epidemiology, but the way that you've seen things like in your role, like data and data analysis used and things like that really are unprecedented in terms of government?
I think so. I just make 2 points on Sue's comments. I think I couldn't agree more. And I think where we're going to is to your point. I think most people instinctively, there's the upside of the flexibility, but then there's also, you can't actually replicate the face-to-face contact. And I think where we're going to is probably like a hybrid where a couple of days in the office, a couple of days at home, flex day in the middle kind of world, which I think is absolutely right. And Sue's point around the, like, this square meter economy is right. And if you sort of play that forward to its natural conclusion, that actually has a lot of significant changes to what the CBD economy looks like. If you've basically got, a couple of million people working and living in the CBD, and if you really thin out that workforce, what does that mean for that, economic ecosystem, and how does that evolve over time, and where does the investment go, and all those kind of things, which is sort of a real fascinating question around where do we live and work across, Greater Melbourne, but also then that opens up regional Victoria and everywhere else you can go. The one thing I'll just also, so I'll go back to your question, Jennifer, in a second. The one thing I'll just also say on the flexibility point though is, for mine, there's often a gap in the flexible economy between essentially, and this is for lack of better descriptors, the sort of white collar economy versus a blue collar economy. And if we actually look at where, for instance, the whole lot of outbreaks happening at the moment, it's because of what would be the positive spin to be flexible work, but is also insecure work. And there's all these workforces that, by virtue of their insecurity and their vulnerability, they are really increased risks. And there are cohorts that aren't, isolating on the basis of financial insecurity. And so I think there just needs to, there's the sort of the flexibility conversation for the totality of the economy needs and the totality of the workforce. It's flexibility with a safety net and with an appropriate sort of focus on the most vulnerable workers, not falling through the cracks as well. But then to go to your question, there's a long lead in, Jeff, on the data question. We've actually had public services, and this is not necessarily Victoria specific, but the public sector is not usually a great early adapter of technology. And but again, like, to go to the acceleration point, we've really had to kickstart a lot of significant shifts in how we use data sharing with the Commonwealth, data sharing across departments, and trying to bring that all into the centre and really have it front of mind for decision making has been really important. And there's sort of been this thirst from, like, our experience with the ministers' offices, for data points, and really trying to get deep into understanding the analytics and what's going on to be able to inform the decision making in a way I haven't really sort of seen it before. And it's really encouraging that sort of, like, this thirst for data and analytics is becoming really quite heightened, and it then has a sort of a new request on the public service to be able to produce that kind of information, essentially also get pretty close to real-time kind of data analytics, because there's no good getting a data point that's 2 weeks old when this thing's moving so fast. So it's not just better analytics and data points, it's also getting close to real time, and having that folded into decision making as best as possible has been something that I think when we get through the crisis, will be a ongoing reform that I think will continue, because it's the benefit has been so profound.
That's another great example. We've talked about evidence-based policy for years, but if people are more comfortable and thinking about working with data, including ministers' offices, I think that's a fabulous trend to potentially continue. And again, what I heard there was a great point about the tension between flexibility and insecurity and insecure work. And even in the white collar realm, you know, and those shouldn't be a trade-off. We need to be really aware of
Mm.
those. And we see that in the statistics about women having a disproportionate major impact on their employment from the COVID stuff, because they're in, you know, flexible work arrangement and or insecure work arrangements. Just starting to wind down a little bit, I want to try to pull you into a slightly different kind of headspace for some potential observations, which is, you know, this is an amazing, ongoing, rolling social experiment. And we're just talking a little bit about insecure work. These kind of pandemics, and they always have, disease always has, tend to open up and show the fault lines in society. And I think that certainly happened in Victoria. I guess I'm wondering if you guys have any reflections that you might want to share this morning about what we're seeing in terms of, you know, social patterns, but also people's behaviors, even all of our individual behaviors in the lockdown, and what might be some learning and opportunities flowing out of that in the longer term. I mean, do you want to start, Sarah? You've got a real passion around, you know, diversity and inclusion. There's been some really interesting kind of challenges and things like working and reaching the full breadth of our very diverse cultural Victorian community, for example.
Yeah, I do. You know, is a great point raised about the potential at these times for the disadvantaged, you know, that gap only to widen, and that's where we have to make explicit choices to not leave those people behind. And my expertise doesn't sit in the realm of that policy making and consideration of all the interrelated structures that need to be considered in order to achieve that. But one comment I will make is that as I imagine in government, it is true also in business that the more diversity that you have around these problems in terms of gender and age and background and cultural background and skills and religion and all of these things, then the more well-rounded perspectives and insights you will gain on that problem, and ultimately the kind of solutions that are going to be most representative for all. So I certainly think that we need to be conscious of the people in the room, you know, the people at the table making these decisions, and that it's happened so often in our past as well, where decisions are made about certain communities, but then they're not party to those conversations. And I really think it's important that that happens at this time.
I love that, people in the room. And that's certainly as much a challenge within government as it is in any other sector.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Sam, what was your thoughts on that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's become, again, apparent. And one of the things that I think is really is scope for improvement. And there's hopefully an intersection between increased digital access and technology that actually allows those things to become easier. That, you know, representation and engagement should hopefully become easier and more, I suppose, more rigorous in a sense in how it sort of feeds into decision making, to make sure that particularly when you're looking at vulnerable communities and communities that are somewhat disconnected from then you get actually being able to reach out to them, engage with them through their leadership, but actually then sort of bring their insights into decision making and having an awareness is really important. And we're finding that through, in DPC, we have the Aboriginal Victoria and Treaty Branch, which are looking after a whole lot of Aboriginal policies at the moment, actually be able to bring that right into the heart of government and actually have them at the table for those sort of self-determination discussions has actually been like a pretty significant change and a really positive change. And I think one that will be enduring, but also can be expanded to, you know, a number of different cohorts.
That's a great example. And having them working right at the center of government, really helps that situation. Sue, reflections from your
Yeah,
perspective?
look, I think that what's been touched on all so far has been excellent. We are a very multicultural country, and we mustn't lose sight of that. So the concept of making sure that everyone understands, what is expected of them and what opportunities there are through the language barriers is something we need to take care of. My mantra in my executive mentoring business is never assume, and we've got to be very careful we don't make assumptions at this time that people understand what is required of them or what the opportunities are or what even the downfalls are going forward. I think, even in relation to some of the lower skilled workers working at the moment in cleanup and disposal of PPE. I mean, this is, toxic hazardous material. We need to make sure that everyone's aware of what's required of them. We need the training to go into that and not assume that because they can drive a truck, for example, they know how to conduct themselves in the workplace. So I think training is going to be really important going forward, and really understanding of the cultural importance of bringing all cultures, especially our Indigenous, to the table is something we really need to focus on.
Yeah, we're all learning a huge amount. I want to use the last few minutes to ask each of you to talk, and I've heard this in numbers of sessions, about what would you say to early career professionals? So put your minds back to the beginning of your career, who, are often, they are digital natives, they are, young and open and enthusiastic and want to be part of these changes, see a lot of these opportunities, will have lots of views on these issues, want to influence, want to be part of change, and hopefully see the benefit of contributing, at least in part of their career, potentially working in the broader public purpose sector, that might be in government or people that work with government. So what kind of advice would you have to young professionals about how can they put themselves into that? How can they influence? And how can they make sure that they can use some of their passion and their ideas in what can be, sometimes, large bureaucratic organizations or hierarchical organizations, or, really tough and complex jobs that might not feel like they've got necessarily room for that. I mean, I'm going to start back with you because you're a professional coach, Sue. So you're coaching people at different ends of the career, but what would you say to the young?
Oh, look, I think there's real opportunity for the young. I mean, for me, put yourself out there, put yourself forward. Don't sit back and wait for someone to invite you to the table. Don't be, too cocky that no one's going to take you on, because that's going to turn people off. But if you've got a really good idea, get through to the hierarchy that you would like to get involvement. Even if you say, I'd love to gain some experience by sitting at the table. And remember, this is not going to be your last career you have. You're going to probably have several careers during your lifetime, but make the most of every opportunity. Ask questions, put yourself out there, and don't, and if the worst thing someone can say to you is no, you're not really that badly off, are you? I mean, you can just keep going forward and keep trying. And I always said to people when I was coaching about the glass ceiling, if you can't break that glass ceiling, step outside and go around it. Don't try keep battering against a ceiling you can't get through. There's other ways to rise to the top. So if you're not getting the opportunity where you are, it's okay to take a side step and move around to go somewhere else to get the responses you need. You've all got an enormous amount to contribute, and just make sure people can hear your voice.
Fantastic. Sam?
I totally agree with Sue. I mean, I think that's right. You just got to have a crack, really. I think it's, particularly now of all times, I think you made the point earlier, like we're at the intersection of so many sort of mega trends that are going on between, where does influence in the world sit, digitization of the economy, aging of the population, and then overlay that with COVID, we're going to have probably a pretty nasty economic recession. So you throw all these things together, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think, believe it or not, not all the leadership of big organizations know exactly what's going to happen and have 100% sort of clarity on what's going to happen as well. So I think, to take Sue's point, I think put your ideas forward and you know, there are different perspectives do matter, and particularly for the younger generation where, you know, a digital transformation is not, you know, it's not a new thing, it's just how they've grown up. And so take your skills, take your knowledge, take your insights, and push into the hierarchy and push into the system and try and get your ideas forward, because the worst thing that can happen is people say no, and then that's fine, you move on.
You know, one that it can sound cliche, or a bit trite, but it always stood me in good stead is also, you know, take risks and say yes. So, you know, I was asked to do I've, you know, mostly worked in economic facilitation, natural resource management, environment. So, you know, very much regional, rural regional, that kind of thing. And I was asked to do a social policy job, a social policy role, working with Victoria's LGBTIQ communities. And I'm like, but I don't do social policy, you know, and, but, you know, I took the role and I learned a huge amount, and it was a great honor to do that role. You know, it's one of the you know, if you can in terms of economics and risks and stuff is to just say yes, and you know, have some humility and be open to learning at all stages of your career. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
Fake it till you make it.
Fake it till you make it is also a really good one. Sarah?
Yeah, I would add, you know, step outside your comfort zone. It builds on a lot of the themes that others have spoken about, but when you're young, you can feel tentative and unsure and lacking in confidence and whatever, and you're being encouraged now to put yourself out there and take risks, which I absolutely agree with. Another way is just to think about it might be, if something makes you feel uncomfortable, kind of sit with that discomfort, but then take it on and say to yourself, you know, whenever I step outside my comfort zone, that's actually when I learn, and I actually truly get to understand what my potential is, what my capabilities are. And that can give you so much confidence. It can give you so much drive and motivation. So take those opportunities. Don't live perpetually outside your comfort zone, because that's not healthy, but do take those opportunities to do it. And to add to what Sam said about the lack of clarity looking into the future, that is true. But from your vantage point, there's no doubt things that you see by way of unmet needs or unexpressed needs. And if you approach decision makers about, you know, being inspired by things that can, the customers, the community, etc., those needs that you will serve into the future, that's really, I think, compelling. And the other thing I'll add is, in my career, I've found, you know, I've had that enthusiasm and wanted to be tenacious about being able to influence and change things. But it can sometimes be deflating. It can take a lot out of you. So I encourage you very much to look after your self-care, because it is hard work when you're trying to bring about change. And one thing that I've found good on that journey for me is what I call finding the others. So sometimes I've felt like I'm the only one. Why doesn't everyone believe what I believe or see what I see? And maybe too, being a woman in a male-dominated industry, I felt that more so. But what I've realised is, if you can find the others, if you can find the other believers, the other change agents, together, you know, you can take on a lot more. So you're never on your own, is what I would also say.
That is fantastic advice. I'd just like to share with you that my husband just brought me a cup of tea. I hope you all have someone in your house bringing you a cup of tea. Self-care is really important. Also, I think that might be the first time he's ever done that. So I think that it's really interesting what being at home and working with people, in interacting with your family and work in different ways. So I'm going to hand pass to Will, because Will is going to facilitate the Q&As, right? And we've got plenty, and I want to encourage people to put them there. But I have to say, so I outed myself as not an optimist. Sarah outed herself as optimist. I haven't quite pinned down Sue and Sam. But I've just got a lot of energy from all of you guys, and I feel like I've just got a tidal wave of optimism from all of you. So I've really appreciated the discussion. Over to you, Will.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yeah, just seconding your thoughts. When we were setting up this session, we were speaking about who we could hopefully get. We really wanted that mix of public and private sector experience and background. And the conversation today, I think, has really made it clear that as we come through COVID and out the other side, that the public and private sector are probably more aligned than we maybe thought, and we'll have to work together to come out the other side of this. And the strategies and ways of thinking are really similar across both sectors. So it's been a great conversation so far. We've got a number of Q&A questions. The one that's got the most votes is an interesting one, and probably something that would have been laughed at about 12 months ago, but it relates to remote working across borders, across states, across cities around the country. So you could live in Melbourne and work in Brisbane, or vice versa. Do our panelists think that that's a legitimate possibility over the next few years?
Of living in one state and working in another?
Yeah.
And working remotely?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, going back to Sam's point before about the CBD, I mean, who knows what the future is going to be? This could be a rebirth of rural Australia as far as workforce opportunities are concerned as well. So, I mean, we might find more and more people, you know, living and working from the country space than we've ever had. And our CBDs may diminish in size, but I don't see it as a problem with working across borders. I mean, I work on boards interstate now.
We actually had, I give two examples. One I've got, it's a colleague of mine who, and this is sort of the most probably romanticized version of the question, is her family own a vineyard in the Adelaide Hills. And so when the crisis first happened, I've got two young kids, they just decamped to the hills and just lived in a winery, and they're still there. And she's working full time and just sort of zooms in from like these rolling hills of, you know, the winery. I think that's right. I think they definitely can. The interesting question, I didn't actually, there's an FT article a couple of days ago which had an interesting proposition, which is though, if you can work from anywhere, can anyone else do your job? I think it's one of those interesting questions around, if you open up this idea of virtual work, even play it through to its sort of, you know, and the next logical conclusion, it would mean that if I can do a job in Queensland, anyone else in the world could do my job here as well. And it's an interesting dynamic, and it was sort of just a thought piece. It wasn't really the end point, but yeah, it is an actually interesting question around what that means and how do you play it forward. The one thing I would say though is there is a tension, and I think one of the things that's come through, and particularly at the end of this crisis, people will want to have that sort of face-to-face contact. And so I think there's always going to be just a balance of how do you reconcile the fact that you can quite comfortably work interstate, but also then how do you somehow bring that level of contact into workplaces, so it's for those people who want it.
Can I just make a comment? I mean, there is a counter school of thought about the dynamism of cities and how much people enjoy working in cities and share ideas in cities and in groups and conglomerations. And Andrew Weir has been, you know, talking about that, including as IPA events. He's an IPA fellow, and he's got an interesting book out, and he works at the City of Melbourne. So I've been hearing him talk about that a bit. So I think there is again, you know, maybe there's a sweet spot in a hybrid, but, you know, even the tech sector, the techiest of the tech sector, you know, place has proved really important, you know, Silicon Valley. Yeah. Or I was reading, my family's from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is was a manufacturing center in the U.S. that died. You know, it was really poor and has, you know, revitalized around med tech. But place still is important. So I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see what the hybrids are.
Yeah, I think you guys might have heard of Atlassian in the tech space, a huge Australian-founded tech business, hugely successful. But they announced, I believe it was last month, to all of their employees that none of them have to return to the office if they don't want to. They call it Team Anywhere, and the elements comprise talent everywhere, work flexibly, and reimagine teamwork. I can also say in Ericsson's case, we're a huge company. since the beginning of March this year, Ericsson shifted the majority of its employees to work from home, basically overnight. And that's 85,000 people. And still today, 85,000 Ericsson people who run our communications networks, work in research and development, in corporate services, whatever it is, we're all nearly 100% working from home. And our global CEO has said that that is going to remain at least until the end of this year. However, I do take the earlier points made, which is there will be a hybrid. So we can currently have a project ongoing to reimagine our workplaces, and they will increasingly be designed as places for social interaction, for group working, for brainstorming, workshopping, all of these types of things that are very, very important as in part of doing our jobs. So
yeah, they're all great points. Personally, I'm saddened at the thought of never going back into the office. I'm really craving the social side, particularly on the Friday afternoon. So some sort of hybrid scenario, maybe with a winery chucked in there, could be a good outcome for me.
Just create a gin distillery at home, Will.
That's it. Or might need a bigger place, but we'll see. Another question coming through, and this has sort of been touched on around inequality in some disadvantaged areas of the community, how there's been a fault line that the pandemic has shown that shows the inequity between service and technology access. And there's still many communities that constantly experience poor issues of disadvantage, such as poor internet or Wi-Fi connectivity, which sort of hinders their ability to engage in the Zoom and virtual ways of working. Can the panelists comment on the role of the public and private sector in addressing some of these issues?
This has got to be something that's front of mind coming out of this pandemic, Will. We've really, we've always talked about the great divide, as far as our society is concerned, but we have to do better. We have to make sure that we look at, picking up these groups in ways that we can support them so that they can have, regain self-esteem and self-worth and become, valuable members of our society. We have to change the way we do things and look at the way that the social dollar is spent and what it's been spent on to create opportunities for these people.
Yeah. I think sometimes, I don't know what it is, like we all know it should be done, so why don't we act with a sense of urgency? A couple of weeks ago, we invited guest speakers from partners of ours. So NBN is a customer of Ericsson's and Skybridge is a partner of ours, and we deploy communications networks out into regional and remote areas all across the country. But most of us sitting in the office or now at home working from a computer, we don't necessarily have a true sense of what is the impact of this access to Wi-Fi, access to the internet, communication, etc., what it really means to these communities, and to hear firsthand of how life-changing it is to see little video clips of Indigenous children just so like hugging the NBN installers, thanking them because now they're able to go to school and their parents are able to get tended to from a healthcare point of view. It's you can't help but be moved by that. So I wonder whether there's something more that we can be doing in shining a light on these stories and shining a light on the impact that it can have, maybe to create more momentum behind the change.
And make sure the monies that do go into the NGO space is actually used wisely and not sort of pumping up administration and support, but actually getting out to the grassroots where it's needed.
Can I hope that there's some potential silver lining and lessons and using Sam's word, accelerated action on things that, again, we've known have been issues for a long time. So I know the Victorian government's done some, and the federal government, but, significant additional investment in mental health, additional significant investment in housing, new models around homelessness. I don't know, Sam, any comment in some of those areas where we are trying new things and maybe accelerating?
I think that's right. And one of the things, one of the sort of the things we're keeping hopefully front of mind is, basically for, the social distancing and pandemic and what will come in the economic sort of downturn, it's sort of we're putting society and the economy on hold for a bit as we sort of everyone just gets through this period. And when you then turn really clumsy language, when you turn it back on, there are actually a whole lot of choices you can make in that process to set up what a new normal should be. And there's inherently, just because we're all human beings, we sort of default to what we knew and to how we did things. And that's just human nature. People default back to their past experience. And I think constantly challenging the past experience and having a bias towards change and a bias towards something different in those, as we sort of come out the other side of this, is going to be really important to make sure we don't close off the opportunities around those kind of things. It's, there's been an assumption that to get healthcare, you always had to see a doctor face to face. And, 9 months, so six, this will be sort of 6 to 9 months in of this process. Telehealth is now becoming quite an accepted platform. So how do you make sure that people recognize that as a more efficient, probably more accessible form of healthcare that becomes built into the business as usual program going forward, rather than everyone just reverting back to going to their local GP, going to the emergency ward as well. And like taking that step further, and how do you use those new interventions to then get into a lot of the really sort of thorny issues that have perennially been a problem, like prevention in healthcare is you break prevention, then the whole system sort of doesn't look after itself. It's not that simple, but if you get into the heart of prevention, and does telehealth give us and technology give us better ways, more sort of at-home ways to get into people's healthcare choices, to really get into prevention issues, which we haven't been able to do before. So I think it's acknowledging that we don't necessarily want to go back to, reverting back to exactly how we did before could close off opportunities. So how do we always keep an open mind that when we come out the other side of this, we open up those opportunities as best we can?
I think the hour exercise is a good example, Sam. At the moment, everyone craves that hour to get out and exercise, but it's post-lockdown. Are they all going to exercise the same amount going forward? And I think it's a really important thing. We just keep pushing that prevention side of it and maintaining your health. Go a long way.
Yeah, and simple things like people riding their bikes, and we're lucky in that we're going, the Southern Hemisphere is going into summer, which means there's this whole range of opportunity in terms of outdoor living, being active, all those kind of things which are available to us, which unfortunately, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, as you go into the depths of winter, it's harder to make those behavioural changes when you're fighting against the elements. So take cycling to work as an example. That's an obvious one where it was probably difficult to get people to cycle to work in the depths of winter. Coming into spring and summer, you can actually make long-term behavioural changes around how people move around the city.
Yeah, there's definitely rapid change. And on that exact topic, another Q&A questions come through, which public purpose jobs and the shift in the skill sets that will be required, particularly for young professionals and people who a year ago, looking at what their careers trajectory was looking like, that's probably looking a lot different now as skilled requirements change and this direction of the industry has shifted. Where does the panel see these public sector jobs going in the future and the skill set requirements?
I would have thought, I'm not in the public sector, but I would have thought there'd be a huge opportunity in planning. I think New Zealand planned pretty well for a pandemic, even though they weren't expecting one necessarily, but they had a lot of resources and stockpile ready to go. Because they followed the lead of countries that had had prior pandemics, with SARS and MERS and Ebola and so forth. So I would have thought if we can take what we've experienced now and use it in planning for the future, it would be a really good start. So the opportunities there, I would have thought. But, Sam or Sarah or Jennifer would have more ideas than me.
I think my sort of, this is a very personal view, my thing is I read widely, look ahead, and basically... And then sort of just have a sense of how the world's moving. Like in the end, inherently the public sector is a slower moving beast than often society is. And so being able to look ahead and just have a sense of where the world's going, the trends that are moving society, I think will always put you in good stead for to be able to position yourself to where those changes are. And as someone who has never really had a data and analytical background and is slowly learning it, I reckon being across data and analytics is really important. Tech, data analytics, these are the things that will drive service delivery, service design, society in the future. I'm a late comer to the game, but I think it's an important skill set to have as well. And the one other thing, sorry, just to go on a bit, is where I think the the way the public sector sets itself up necessarily, particularly in somewhere like Victoria, where you've got a Westminster system, which necessarily then has ministers and departments, is you automatically create silos, and even with the best intentions, you narrow down work streams. I think being across the stitching between departments, understanding how problems, like very rarely, departments of state now reflect, basically ministerial alignment from a century ago. Understanding now that no real issue government faces can be solved from one point of view. Understanding how to use the levers and see across government to know all the levers to bring to bear on a problem, which makes you sort of inherently a bit of a generalist, is I think something that will be increasingly of value, because it's not going to be, a single department can't solve the big issues that are coming for the next 10 years.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly concur. Invest in your digital skills and competency. Data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, they are things not just for technical people. Trust me, because I'm not a technical person, but obviously in the company I work for, I'm surrounded by it all day, and it is going to pervade all aspects of industry and society and government. I think, big question for Australia is, what sort of country do we want to be coming out of this? And the overlay on the COVID situation is also the increasing geopolitical tensions that we've all been observing, and that's another disruptor. And yes, Australia's had a historical allegiance with the US, but we equally have very important trade relations with our neighbours in the region, especially China. And what we're seeing is China becoming increasingly powerful in our global economy, and certainly emerging from this COVID crisis better than most. So we've kind of got that at play at the same time as all this discourse about the growing threat around national sovereignty and security, including cybersecurity. I reckon security is a growing space to be in. But I also want to reflect back to what Sue said almost at the beginning of this, which is look at the homegrown, look at what's local here, because another decision I reckon Australia has to make is, what are we going to do with our homegrown research and development and innovation capability? There's this renewed and amplified focus on innovation at this time, and we really need to capitalise on harnessing our homegrown research capabilities, recalibrating our research agendas to respond, coming out of this as we... Exactly. And as we look to recovery, invest in them, make the policy adjustments that need to be made, get the funding structures right. All of these considerations need to be given to the funding mechanisms, the commercialisation opportunities, and the role, absolutely, of both public and private collaboration in that. As a country, we need to be developing these strategies for our future.
Can I make a comment that, when I listen to you, we need to, all of you, and again, there's a lot of opportunity there and implied risk. A key area that we need to apply all this to is, of course, probably the biggest risk accelerator that humans have ever faced, which is climate change. So you can think of that concretely, but as its own thing, but you can also think about it as accelerating a whole range of risk. And a lot of the human diseases that we're dealing with are coming out of, including this pandemic, disruption of the natural world and the interface between people and the natural world. And we've just had a bushfire that is 15 million hectares, burning things that don't usually burn. So I think that the confluence of economic and environmental social will need all the skills and perspectives. I absolutely support everything being said about data and analytics and IT, but I'd also make this contrarian comment, because that's the kind of person I am. What are we fighting this pandemic with right now, that we're having right now in Victoria? And we are fighting it with social isolation. We are fighting it with putting masks on and not getting too near other people and washing hands. And that's what people did in 1919 as well, with the last big pandemic we have. So I think it's a fascinating thing. Nobody in 1919 was able to Zoom each other. It's a fascinating confluence of old and new. And I started talking about a book about history. So I also think it's important to have that perspective. And I also think it's important that in our sectors, we have people that come to the table who might be historians or who might bring social and behavioral science to the table and other perspectives and skills. So when we talk about diversity, let's keep that in mind. Let's keep that thought in mind. And, you know, one of the things that haunts me, it's haunted me for years, but I've thought about a lot this year is anyone ever, it's closed, we can't go now, but you know, when we can travel, go down to Point Nepean National Park, if you haven't been there, on the tip of the Mornington Peninsula, and go walk around the quarantine station, and they had these little tar sheds that might still be standing, and that's where they took people off the boats in 1919. And of course, in that pandemic, it was young people that were at risk to die, which was one of the differences. So it's a wonderful historical perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess on that topic of collaboration, the public and private sectors have always sort of been, I guess, one side looks at the other side and laughs a bit. I would know I started my career in the public sector and I've come across to the private, but still in the public purpose area. Given the increased collaboration that's required during the pandemic and sort of guns have been put down and we're all trying to work together for the best interests of the health and safety and the economy of the entire country, what can the private sector learn from the public, and inversely, what can the public sector learn from the private?
Ooh.
If anything.
Lots.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and look, I think the public policy stuff that's been going on now and the data analytics that Sam's talking about are always really good baseline ingredients into the future of work and understanding what's required. And I think the private sector hasn't invested in a lot of that for a long time. I mean, they've sort of grown through commercial need, or, you know, whether it's a manufacturing company or a healthcare company and so forth. So understanding all those and the importance of the policy and what the policy relates to is something I think the private sector can gain from.
Yeah, I mean, my thing also is one of the, I often think of the outsourcing of work to private sector consultants sometimes is at the expense of the public sector training up and learning up. So how do we make sure there's skills transfer between the two? Because I think there are different worldviews and each could learn better from each other if there was a bit more of an engaging environment rather than it's sort of a purely contracted arrangement as well. And I think also, I mean, on the broad, there's obviously a profit motive involved for the private sector, but it's often an unhelpful, I think, probably perspective to think they're against each other. It's more just they come at them from different angles. And I think if you sort of set the problems in society are big enough that we need all the help we can get to solve them. So how do you capture both streams of work and bring them together into a way that collaborates as best as possible? And there's also areas where, I mean, if we look across both public and private sector, arguably Australia could do better at how we, continually reskill our workforces. We could arguably be better at how we have a much deeper tech and digital ecosystem across both sectors than we do. We could have a much better, understanding of how we work flexibly and better. Like, there's a whole lot of things that are also cross-cutting across both sectors where each can learn from each other, but ultimately make for a better economy, better society if we can do them more collaboratively as well.
Yeah, agreed. I would also like to see more movement of, career public servants into private and career private. I think a colleague that I work with closely on their leadership team, she came from government and now into our organisation, and she's just awesome and brings a perspective and a set of experiences and networks and, all of these things that we generally haven't had in our company. And likewise, I think having people who've come from the private sector embedded in government for a stint in their career would, I think that movement of people across the sectors will make the cross-pollination more fertile, probably.
I mean, there's been a lot written and debated about this. I guess personally, a couple of comments I'd make is that, including over this year, working with small publicly listed companies, really the private sector parts of the private sector can really look at risk and manage risk in a different way. So it is about, how they can raise capital and how they can manage risk and move quite quickly and think about risk appetite. That equation in bureaucracies, is very different and mediated through our political and other systems. And the other thing, that again it can be a bit cliche, but I've often found true, is that a relentless focus on customer and client focus, which can get really lost sometimes in some government operations. So on the other hand, I think most of the people that I work in the public sector sometimes can bring a broader systemic view and deal with a lot of complexity and ambiguity, including what is success in multiple dimensions and in complex ways. So yeah, absolutely, things to learn from each other, and cross-fertilization would be great.
Yeah, I think having worked across both public and private in my sort of short career, one thing that I think might get lost on people sometimes is that we all are on the same team. It's just sort of approaching it in different ways. So that wraps up our Q&A. It's been a fantastic discussion. Lots of great points and insights. I hope everyone on the call has enjoyed it. Just like to thank again our host Jennifer and our three panelists, Sue, Sarah and Sam, for your wonderful insights. IPA Victoria is a fantastic organisation. So for those on the call, remember to immerse yourselves in all the great initiatives that are on offer. Programs and events coming up include our Caring for Country series in partnership with the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council in September and October. These events are part of IPA's free lunchbox seminars. And there's also the Public Sector Week coming up in September.
Actually, we deferred that.
Oh, have we?
We haven't updated your script.
Okay, forget about the Public Sector Week in September. That's been deferred.
It'll happen.
It'll happen sometime. And for further details on these events and any other professional development opportunities, visit the IPA Victoria website or follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. And for those on the call, there's been a short survey will appear in your browser. We'd really appreciate it if you could give us your feedback to help improve and better support the sector. Thank you again for our YIPA Masterclass Series partners, the Victorian Public Sector Commission, Victoria Managed Insurance Authority, and to Deloitte, and to all our people attending and to our participants again. Enjoy the final week of the YIPA Masterclass Series.